Hello and welcome into Discern. Today is Tuesday, December 28th. I'm Ross, and we are joined again by guest contributor Kerby Anderson. Hello, Kerby.
Good to be with you, Ross. Looking forward to talking about this topic that affects just about everybody.
It sure does. Kerby is the host of the radio talk show Point of View, and we've been really blessed to have him on to help us kind of look at some economic topics, some topics in the Supreme Court, and some things that he talks about on his show quite a bit. And honestly, some areas that I have some knowledge gaps. So for me, it's helpful to understand these topics and maybe how I can think about them, because sometimes the language gets dense and I find myself going, I need help. And so Kerby's going to help us do that. Today's topic is inflation. On the outset, what even is that? We're going to get into it because that's a word that people use. And what do we think about it? And so let's see what's going on in the news today, and then we'll unpack that topic. So this is from CNN. Morgan Moore's grocery bills are sky high. She started shopping more frequently at Dollar General for basic meats, dairies, and eggs as a result. Prices there, she's found, are a little bit cheaper, but still not as cheap as I'd like them to be. Higher prices for groceries are putting pressure on many Americans' groceries budgets, forcing them to change how they shop for food and essentials. Last month, grocery prices were 6.4% higher than they were a year ago, the fastest pace of food inflation in more than a decade. Some shoppers are responding by trimming the number of products they're buying at the store and trading down to less expensive private label brands, according to companies, market data, public surveys, and interviews with customers. Others are just switching to cheaper stores. So Kerby, this is all about money. We've talked about stewardship and how to make decisions about our money. That's not really the topic today, though. We're really talking about things that are affecting price. I thought it might be helpful to even start today. When we talk about money, what is the background on money? And maybe that'll help us understand inflation better.
You know, Ross, one of the things I did is I had a booklet that was entitled A Biblical View on Money, but part of it was just the history, which let's go through it fairly quickly because we've always had some kind of medium of exchange. And in some of the places it was stones. In Africa it was beads. There have been other places where it has been shells. And in each particular case, the assumption was that since you had a limited supply of those, that could be used as a medium of exchange. The problem is that once, especially in many cases, the various European countries landed there, they realized that they, for example, in Africa, could produce beads much more inexpensively and thus, if you will, inflate the money. So we've always had a situation in which you would want to have kind of a fixed supply of whatever that medium of exchange might be. And in the past, like I said, it's been shells, it's been beads, it's been various things. Eventually, they settled on very valuable metals, and that would be like silver and then eventually gold. Especially after the various modern countries began to go to what was called the gold standard, some stayed on silver. They didn't do as well, but gold was certainly the ideal kind of basis for your money because it is a relatively inelastic demand. Yes, you still have about 1 or 2% of gold being found each year, but bottom line, it was a pretty standard particular medium of exchange. But again, trying to move gold from one country to the next or from one individual to the next, they finally decided that they would give you paper certificates based on the gold. So you didn't have to move the gold around. So that's where we got to the point of paper money. Well, eventually, many of these countries got off of the gold standard. Even in the United States, we got off the gold standard in 1971 when Richard Nixon, the president, shut the gold standard and gold window. And so as a result, once you no longer had a fixed amount of anything, then we have seen over time the printing of money. If you increase the amount of money supply for the same amount of goods and services, then the value of those dollars that you have in your pocketbook or your purse or your wallet begins to diminish. And so that's the difficulty that we have, that up until now we have had certainly a standard that would say we would no longer be able to print more money unless we had gold to back it up. Once we went off of that, we've had a massive printing of various kind of paper dollars. Certainly in 2008, rate, and after that you had what was called quantitative easing, which is a technical term simply saying I'm just printing more money. And then during the pandemic and lockdown, because we wanted to give everybody financial benefits, the money supply just almost went vertical. And so we are at a point now where we are seeing inflation, and inflation is where you have more dollars chasing the same number and amount of goods and services. So that's why in many cases we have inflation today.
And so you've heard the term printing money, and it's often used in kind of a negative way. And so also, I think sometimes I've thought, okay, does that actually mean we're printing more money? And so can you just explain, we're actually printing more paper, certificates, as you say. Is that actually what's going on? And then why are we having to do that? And then why specifically in the pandemic is that a problem?
Well, first of all, we don't technically print it anymore. We just simply move ones and zeros on a spreadsheet. But the bottom line is that when you actually spend more than you take in, and the federal government has been doing this for a long time, state governments almost always have to balance their budget. The federal government has not balanced its budget in a long period of time. And so as a result, you can realize that if you, for example, made $30,000 a year, and yet you are spending $60,000 a year, you'd have to figure out how to make that up. Lots of people put it on their credit card. Well, the credit card for the federal government is actually printing money, but when we print it, we're really simply saying that we are having the Federal Reserve buying these treasury notes. It used to be that people would buy those notes. Even China, Japan, the UK, Saudi Arabia would buy those notes. They're not buying them anymore. So in a sense, the Federal Reserve is buying them, but in order to buy them, they have to create more money. So we're back to that whole issue of actually spending more than we take in. By the way, there's an obvious application, Ross. We should not actually require the federal government to balance its budget if we can't balance our budget. And so when we look at, for example, I've written about this issue of debt. Consumer debt is at an all-time high. Student loan debt is at an all-time high. But also the national debt is at an all-time high. And so it seems to me that we need to come back to some biblical principles of living within our means, both as individuals and as a government. But what about this issue of inflation? The argument has always been, Ross, that, well, inflation is partially due to the printing of money, but it's also due to a variety of other things. And we've had some problems with the supply chain. So I'll be willing to admit that when you see some of the prices going up, it's due to a limit in the supply chain. If you can't get goods and services off of container ships in Long Beach, then obviously, if you've gone to grocery stores recently or department stores recently, you've noticed some pretty empty shelves. So when the demand is high and the supply is low, guess what? Prices go up. So some of that, no doubt, is due to supply. But the bottom line is a great deal of that is due to the money printing. And back to your question of, well, why was that during the pandemic? Well, when we had a downturn in the economy, when everybody was essentially sequestered in their homes, then we needed to jumpstart the economy. So the theory went. And as a result, we provided benefits. And most of our viewers here probably received a check from the federal government. Well, has that been produced in any way? No, that was simply printed to stimulate the economy. And so we went from a time in which we had an increase in the money supply to a rapid increase in the money supply. And then, of course, now you've had the political realm, because then their decision was not only to stimulate the economy due to the issue of COVID-19, but then to spend money on infrastructure, now even to spend more money on some of these other political issues. You add all that together, and the money supply has increased in round numbers about 30% in the last 18 months. And that means ultimately those dollars in your pocket are worth a lot less than they were, say, 2 years ago.
So practically, as we process this, should we see inflation as something to fear? Should we simply see it as a factor of our environment we need to prepare for? Like, how do we process this?
And I think that's a good point, because what we've seen, Ross, is that first we had people that were economic experts, and I put experts sometimes in quotes, but they could be with the Federal Reserve, they could be politicians, they could be economists, that say, oh, well, the inflation really isn't an issue at all. Then we started seeing they said, well, there's inflation, but it's transitory. And now everybody's saying, no, it's not transitory. It's going to be around for some time. Because if you look at the consumer price index, this is the highest it's been since 1982. Now, I also want to add a disclaimer. The consumer price index, if it was calculated today the way it was in 1980, then it wouldn't be 6.8%. It would be about 15%. And that's because they've changed the basket of goods that they measure. So in some respects, there is a little bit of manipulation of all of that. And so when the individuals are now saying, well, we've got inflation, but that might actually be good. I've actually seen individuals that are writing articles in New York Times and Washington Post and other places saying, well, actually inflation might be good. Well, let's be honest. It is good for people that have appreciating assets. If you are wealthy and you actually have money in the stock market, or you've invested in various types of stores of value that are not actually being inflated, and that's why some people go into things like Bitcoin, as well as buying gold and those kinds of things that tend to not have a very significant inflation number, then you're going to probably do okay. If you invest in art, or like I said, cryptocurrency, or the stock market or real estate, you're probably doing fine. What about the poor, though? They find themselves seeing an increase in both the expense of energy and food. Well, when you're poor, a disproportionate large part of that income that you have, of your expenses, are those two factors which have been increasing dramatically. So if you want to look at the long-term implication of it, you're going to see greater and greater income inequality that's going to take place. The wealthy will be able to still manage their resources in ways to maybe keep even with or even keep ahead of inflation. Is that something that people that are middle class or lower class are able to do? So while I will acknowledge that some people might actually benefit from inflation, individuals that own property or rent out property can then justify raising the rents, refinancing, and causing people to pay more for their mortgage. But for a lot of other people, as a matter of fact, most of our viewers watching right now, they're going to be harmed by inflation, because if they want to try to even keep pace with inflation, let's even assume that it's a 6.8% increase. How many of the people watching right now have seen their wages go up 6.8%? More importantly, I think that the real number is closer to 15%. And if that's the case, how many of us have seen our wages increase 15%? Matter of fact, how few stocks have appreciated by 15%. Certainly, Bitcoin has appreciated that much, but that's why you see people beginning to invest in things they've never invested in before, because they're concerned about the inflationary pressure, and they wonder whether or not they're able to keep pace with the inflation that seems to be increasing day by day.
Well, I understand inflation a lot better just out of this conversation, and appreciate you helping us unpack and understand this. Kerby, I hope we'll have you back in future episodes, especially on these topics that you know so much about, and hopefully this has been helpful to our viewers. So that's going to be our show for today. We'll see everybody right back here next time on Discern.